Imagine a deal so big, it promises everything from pipelines, power lines, data centers, nuclear energy, carbon capture infrastructure, and indigenous partnerships, all in one handshake. Sounds like a climate plan, an industrial strategy, and a national unity project walked into a bar together and decided to co-author a press release. The Memorandum of Understanding between the federal Liberal Government of Canada and the provincial United Conservative Party of Alberta has prompted the return of pipelines and turbines. That's right. We've dusted off the microphones and fired up the coiling machines and whatever other things are associated with podcasts to wade back into the murky waters of pipeline politics, power generation, industrial decarbonization, and the social impacts of nation building projects. Because suddenly, all of it's back in front page headlines in this new geopolitical era we find ourselves in. And we're going to unpack every one of them together. I'm Leor Rotchild, and I'm joined once again by my co-conspirators, Jason Switzer and Janet Annesley. And today we're going to be cracking open the MOU signed by Ottawa and Alberta. This is the deal that sent environmental groups into overdrive, coincided with the departure of Stephen Guilbeault from cabinet, and prompted the resignation of two members of Canada's net zero advisory body, Simon Donner and Catherine Abreu. Plenty has been said about this topic, lots of hot takes out there, but very little attention has been paid to the actual words in the MOU and what they really mean for climate, communities, and Canada's future. Fortunately, we have two of Canada's foremost experts to help us separate the signal from the noise and unpack what this means for Canada's economy and climate future. Janet, Jason, welcome back to Pipelines and Turbines.
It's great to be back, Leor. I feel like the MOU was the best Christmas gift for energy policy wonks that we could have ever asked for. It's a gift that's going to keep on giving throughout 2026 and beyond.
It's interesting you say it, because not everybody agrees that it was a gift. Some people are losing their minds and saying this is a betrayal. This is, hey, we thought we were electing a federal leader who is, created the climate finance framework for the planet. And now he's going all in on increased fossil fuel extraction. Jason, what's your sort of overall feeling about the MOU generally?
Well, I feel like I've been out of shape. This is almost like a New Year's resolution. It's great to be back here, but I'm like blowing the dust off. If we were to kind of go back to whatever it was in 2023, the last time we did this, the very idea that there would be a partnership between the federal government and the provincial government, that there would be standing ovations for a prime minister at a town hall in Calgary.
A liberal prime minister.
Yes. A liberal prime minister, even that we would have a liberal prime minister in Calgary is something of a sci-fi scenario. And it can't be looked at in isolation. You have to put it in the context of a world where the leader of the country with the largest petroleum reserves in the world, Venezuela, was just scoop slammed out of Caracas in the last little bit, which means all bets are off in terms of international law and geopolitics. So we're in a kind of remarkably different world. And this MOU has to play within it. So I've been doing my podcast sit-ups since January 1st and trying to get myself in shape post-turkey and pre-podcast for this one.
Well, that's fitting because, being on a podcast is like, really putting your thoughts, your ideas out there, and it's it can be vulnerable. And so, like, if you're going to be naked, you might as well be buff, right, Jay? So those sit-ups will come in handy.
Hey man, I'm well past the sell by date on shirts off. So, but hey, let me say this. So I think the MOU opens up some really interesting terrain. It's this multi-dimensional play. Um, and for a country that's used to playing checkers, this is definitely an aspiration at political chess. Is it a sort of net good for climate? Is it net good for Canadian industry? What does it mean for Indigenous relationships and rights in the context of some very transformative decisions here in British Columbia, where I'm based these days? There's so much to unpack here, and I'm ready to roll up my sleeves. Where should we start?
Well, let's start with the MOU itself. Let's unpack it together and dive right into the actual words that are in the MOU, not just um, the vibes and the hot takes, but actually look at the words. And one thing that's interesting is I'm kind of calling it like sort of like four strong winds, one power grid. There is like a big focus on electricity, interties, and and power, the politics of power. And what the MOU actually says is that Canada and Alberta commit to significantly expanding electricity generation and transmission, including new interprovincial interties with British Columbia and Saskatchewan, while achieving a net zero electricity sector by 2050. Alberta's existing tier program or tier system is explicitly recognized as sufficient for this pathway. Now, from my point of view, electricity is really the quiet backbone of everything else we're going to talk about, that's in this MOU. Pipelines don't decarbonize themselves. Data centers don't run on good intention. Electrification only works if the grid is clean and reliable and big enough. So is that what's happening? Is that, are we building a grid that's big enough to house Canada's electrification needs? Is that what's going on here, Janet?
Well, I think you're right. There's a big thread of power through this MOU. Even when you look at the Pathways project, for example, the actual units that would be decarbonized are the power generation units. So we've got a bunch of questions about how that gets done and how CCS can possibly work for Pathways, but CCS can't possibly work for natural gas combined cycle plants, which is why the CER is unworkable. So lots to dive into. I think we need to
CER,
have
sorry,
the
sorry,
clean
unpack
electricity
that.
regulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. The clean. So CCS can work for Pathways, but it can't work to decarbonize power in a commercial environment. And that's why the clean electricity regulations don't work in power markets like Alberta. And that's a whole other episode. I think we need to unpack the Alberta conundrum of power markets. I just spent 4 years at Kuitno Energy, where we were trying to build some of the newest, best, cleanest gas-fired units. We had two carbon capture hubs alongside those, and we weren't exactly successful in that endeavor. And there's a lot of reasons why, but it does go back to the economics. So that is the other big thread in the MOU, really the golden thread throughout it, is how do we actually get projects moving ahead, whether they're clean projects that need to get more certainty out of carbon pricing, that we need to drive ahead on iterations of technology, and or they could be liquid oil pipeline projects to get hydrocarbons to the West Coast. And, critics of the MOU might say, well, there isn't even a proponent. So what are the economics of that? And going way back for Jason and I to our days at Shell Canada, when we did the Quest project, it's like, again, everything that's old is new again, is how do we get another major milestone in Alberta for CCS? How do we actually get a big project done so we can put some points on the board for decarbonization? Do we believe that we'll get the oil sands to net zero? Well, probably not. And I think that actually, all in all, the MOU is a massive reality check on how we can move things forward and get things done. So I know, depending on your perspective, some people are really disappointed. But for those of us who toil in the trenches, I think the MOU starts to open up the world of possibility to finally unlocking, breaking through the logjam of confusing and uncertain policies to potentially, and it's not there yet, this is not the proverbial, fat lady has not sung. This is just getting started, folks. So for those who quit their important climate posts, I think maybe you quit too soon. It's just getting started.
Well, just getting started. I love that as a theme because that's what we're doing here. We're just getting started. Jason, you want to jump in?
Well, I like what Janet said, right? This is an attempt to cut the Gordian knot of overlapping jurisdictions and sort of bidirectional and competing legislative intentions that are embedded in all these different policies. So like all these different policies marching in wonderfully different directions, beautifully siloed, both provincially and thematically, and leading us exactly nowhere. So I kind of picture this as the Gordian knot slash, right? Where if all of a sudden we have all these new degrees of freedom, but they're bound by a really interesting timeline, which is the substance of the last page of the MOU. And if you look at it, it's we are in as Canada for what could be the busiest first quarter of policy development and negotiation federally and provincially in human history. So park your enthusiasm or curb your enthusiasm, right? But I think it's important to talk about what this MOU actually contains. There's a bunch of gets, there's a bunch of gives, and then there's a bunch of uncertainties. And so I tried to read this thing and put them and categorize them like that. And unfortunately, ChatGPT couldn't help me with this because this gets into the world of wonk, and I have to admit I'm a little out of shape, so you'll have to forgive me. But here's my list of here's what Alberta gets, and here's what they give. Here's what actually let me take it a different. Here's my list of here's what the federal government gets, and here's what it gives to Alberta. So here goes. The gets. So you get a data center and AI build out focused on Alberta, which is both a federal goal. We got a new cabinet minister, Evan Solomon, podcaster himself, and an ambitious agenda to establish data sovereignty. Bring the data center and AI industry to Canada. You get a robust industrial carbon price, and we could do a whole thing on what happens when you have kind of constant tampering with a sort of independent price mechanism and market, and how if you keep putting your hand on the rules and taking money out of the bank, pretty soon no one wants to play Monopoly anymore.
Sorry to interrupt you. You say tampering, Jason. I say undermining. Please continue.
Yes. Oh no. And then you get motion on the CCUS project, which hopefully becomes the sort of unblocking of the logjam for CCUS generally in Canada. And all that comes with a bunch of gives on things like the clean electricity regulation, the tanker ban, major project support, so a sort of effort to bulldoze the bureaucracy, greenwashing, which has been a pain point, not just in Alberta, but across the country, and then some sort of expedited resolution of methane equivalency on terms TBD, and where again you get some interesting kind of gamesmanship going on between the province and the feds. So that there's some gets and gives, and that's my nutshell to the CEO. Janet, how did I do?
I think you did really well, Jason. I think, I would just say that I don't know. I actually think that the feds did a lot more getting than giving in this MOU. That people underestimate the degree maybe of dysfunction of the Gordian knot that you spoke about, that we were going nowhere slowly under the myriad of pancakes and different systems of not only jurisdictions, but fundamental philosophies that were backstopping not only Canada's climate plan, but also our economic industrial plan. And all this was brought into stark relief by Donald Trump, as you say, continues to be brought into stark relief with the latest move in Venezuela. But, all of this is very dependent on fixing things that should have never gone wrong. Back in 2015, 2016, when there was the first discussion, I think nationally, about whether or not we should have pipelines to the West Coast and how we were going to get that done at the same time as advancing Canada's climate objectives, people forget that greenhouse gas emissions weren't even a consideration in the regulatory processes, either provincially or federally, for new projects. And I think the pendulum has swung so far the other way that we started guaranteeing, or the government started, guaranteeing a net zero energy system, and certainly electricity system, by 2035, without doing the homework on how that was actually going to get done. So by going back to basics on carbon pricing, going back to basics on how we actually work to finance some of these projects, whether it's pathways that needs an industrial carbon price, that needs market mechanisms in addition to tax incentives, and a whole host of subsidies, if you want to call them that, in order to get going, or the AI and data center build out. Well, you simply cannot build data centers under the CER in Alberta because you don't have either the reliable electricity coming from intermittent renewable sources, or you don't have the clean electricity that you can actually operate these plants in a mere 9 years under the CER. So who's going to invest $3 billion and have to turn off their facility in 9 years? You can't perhaps make your money back. You don't know under Alberta's new market rules. You don't know if you can make your money back, but you certainly can't get a return. And if you've been out talking to stakeholders, and I'll put this to you, Leor, about what they want to see in their backyard, because you spend so much of your time working with communities and working with stakeholders around sustainability challenges. I had, much friendlier encounters back in my days with Shell, talking about bitumen upgraders in Fort Saskatchewan with farmers, than I did talking about either solar farms or carbon capture on with power plants with Koitno Energy. So it's just a hard sell to many rural Albertans about why they should have these facilities in their neighborhoods. So I think we've got to, this is a good reset, and we haven't even talked about methane. We have had so much success on the methane file. We have reduced methane emissions in the oil and gas industry by more than 50%, and it's a good stretch target for 75. But we can't get there if we don't fix these other things. I would actually say there's more hope on methane because we have the commercial technology today, and what we need is the actual business case to get those projects done. So when I look through this MOU, I see nothing but opportunity. I think there's still going to be a whole lot of heavy lifting when it comes to actually getting these projects done. And we didn't even talk, Leor, about the stakeholders and Indigenous nations that need to be brought in to this discussion. And perhaps, a criticism of this that we saw in December was that Indigenous nations, nor the government of British Columbia, was really brought in as this thing was being formulated and brought together. So how do we quickly start to get those voices heard?
Yeah, really So do you guys have any opinions on this at all, really? Um,
No.
just a few things to say. I'm glad we got through one part of the MOU here. There's only a lot more. Um, but you raised so many great touch points that we need to revisit. Um, and in particular, I mean, in this conversation about electricity and decarbonization, one thing that we haven't perhaps, that I want to double click on further here is around the point around interties, the interties between Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan. Can you can you help to unpack how can interties actually lead to emissions reduction? Jason,
Let
yes.
me take that one. I find that fascinating. So years back when I was at the Pembina Institute, we did a lovely study of Western grid integration supported by the Suncor of that period, which was a very different, very interesting company in its efforts to try and build momentum around decarbonization at a systemic level. The Trottier Energy Foundation did a study looking at pathways to deep decarbonization for Canada, and then this goes back roughly a decade. One of the things they found is that grid integration would have a massive beneficial impact. That we send a lot of our hydro, if you look at Quebec, as well as BC, we're sending a lot of our lowest carbon electricity south of the border instead of sending it across the provinces, and that we have very throttled intertie capacity between the provinces. What that means in practice is that each province kind of runs their electricity market in a way that they view as most beneficial. So BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, really operate as monopolies, right? Where a crown corporation is the provider of the electricity. There are some smaller producers that are allowed to play at the margins, but broadly speaking, it's Hydro Quebec, it's Manitoba Hydro, it's BC Hydro that are operate largely as a sort of piggy bank for the provincial governments. And in that world, they're very jealous about maintaining that privilege, even if from a systems perspective, it's the least efficient, both for the consumers as well as for industry in terms of provision of power. So creating interties has these very interesting outcomes. A lot of them are very complicated. I think maybe Janet has a lot to say from the perspective of a small scale interdependent power producer trying to play against the incumbents in that space. But all of which to say interties, according to the study that was done with the Canadian Society of Engineering, that would dramatically reduce the overall cost of decarbonization for the electricity sector and for Canada generally, but that overcoming the political and institutional challenges of integrating the markets is it ain't an engineering problem.
And does it have the opportunity to send a whole bunch of renewable power uh, over the mountains into Alberta to help decarbonize the fossil fuel industry? Is that part of it too?
That would absolutely be part of it. I mean, you can decarbonize the grid. Alberta's grid has been pretty rapidly decarbonizing. We have got off coal. We have significantly with the build out of solar and wind in southern Alberta. The grid intensity is projected, by the end of this year to be 0.459 tons per megawatt hour, which is down, a good 35%, maybe 40% from what it was. And so we've done a huge amount. But if we could bring in hydro to even further reduce the grid intensity in Alberta, that would help everyone. That would help all industries, not just oil and gas. But I think what's important is, what the point that Jason made is that it looks like it's a very common sense thing to build interties and to, take electricity from other jurisdictions at times that they don't need it. And if they have, extra and it's at a low cost, but it does open up other issues because over the long term, we don't have to look any further really than Newfoundland and Quebec or to the recent discussions around the Atlantic Loop to understand, all of the variables here. If you're BC, why would you want to sell perhaps Alberta your power and not Washington State? It's in your own best interest to send it to the market that's going to pay the most. So it's not like Alberta is going to get a special deal because we happen to be Canadian. No, no. BC Hydro is going to look after British Columbians because that's its job. And same thing, as an Albertan, why would I sign a 30-year power agreement with British Columbia to procure billions and billions of dollars worth of power rather than build those facilities in my own backyard? So there are a lot of considerations that really have to come into the discussion around interties. But certainly there's lots of ways to optimize with them, but we should not rely on power from another jurisdiction in order to meet our climate or our energy and our reliability goals. And we haven't even talked about affordability.
So, yeah,
which apparently
great,
is made
great
up.
points.
Is that what did Trump say? That's just a
The
affordability
Democrats
is
made up that
they
term. Yeah,
that's right. I can
that's
assure
right.
you,
Yeah.
not made up.
Hey,
I thought it
so
was a Chinese hoax.
right, yeah. So hey, so we talked about this idea of, one power grid. But like one of the important parts, and you've touched on this around having access to more power, is powering this data center bonanza. And so like we're talking about AI, we're talking about um, uh, the energy demand that's going to come with the influx of data centers. But again, going back to what the MOU actually says here, by July 1st, 2026, Alberta will implement a policy framework to incentivize large-scale data center development, including thousands of megawatts of AI computing power, with a significant portion dedicated to sovereign cloud for Canada and its allies. So this is like
Well,
talking about like an energy demand bomb here, like AI data centers, um, uh, like kind of flip the script, right? Like it's sort of like this idea of like centrally controlled, energy scarcity, controlling the price, or having an influence on the price, and basically saying, no, we need as much power on the grid as humanly possible, and that the MOU kind of treats them as like an economic prize, not necessarily a climate liability. Is that a good interpretation?
well, I think there's more to it than even that. I mean, data centers are super tricky. I think on the surface, it's just everyone pictures a big warehouse with a bunch of computers in it. But there's not only the power needs that you did, talked about, and where that power is going to come from. And there's the economics of that power. For example, and how that power, the how we can provide power not only to the data center developers economically, reliably, and in a manner that's clean and not going to be a climate bomb. Um, there's also the consideration, of course, about what data center demand, if not accompanied by power, will do to ordinary ratepayers like you and me. If I don't want to have to compete, just like BC Hydro would like to send their power to Washington State because they'll pay the most. You and I, Leor, could be competing with Google, and I can guarantee you who's got deeper pockets to keep the lights on. It's certainly not me. So those are real considerations. And Chinese Bitcoin miners, the kind of people that have been in some ways sniffing around our backyard in Alberta, I'm not the most liberalized person when it comes to my own certainty around things like crypto. But when you're looking at building massive billion-dollar facilities and hooking those facilities up to long-term gas contracts, that those Chinese Bitcoin miners are not going to be given credit by large companies that are notoriously risk averse, like Enbridge and TC Energy. So who actually is going to be holding the bag for the cost of building out these facilities and making sure that they've got the infrastructure to get the gas? I do have some concerns if that entity is going to be the government of Alberta or the government of
I think it's
Canada,
Kevin
because
O'Leary. I think he's got it. He's got it covered.
he's going to he's going to put his MasterCard down and say, I got it. I got the 30-year gas contract. It's all good. Sure. I
Um,
think I have some concerns if it's you and me.
and speaking of concerns, is there a concern? I mean, you talked about that issue of like who's got the bigger bucks, you or Google, but like for homeowners and people using transit and other like smaller industry, are they going to be competing with the power needs of these data centers?
Potentially, which is why the Alberta government initially moved to cap the demand that data centers could put on the grid, and there was a lot of criticism of that cap. So it's bring your own power. If you're going to be developing a data center in Alberta, you got to have that plan. But if you're grid connected, and this gets back deeply into the MOU, then you're subject to the CER, the Clean Electricity Regulations. And that basically, those requirements there, if you even think you can meet the 65 ton a gigawatt hour standard by 2035, which, by the way, is very ambitious, that meeting that standard is at least going to double your capital costs. So now, if I'm Google, am I thinking Alberta is such a great place to build this, or would I rather just go to Texas? So this is where the MOU really, you pull back the layers of it and it starts to get super interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. Jason, let me ask you an interesting question. Based on your work with Equitable Origin, you're talking to data centers and you're talking to folks who are building that infrastructure and talking to them about the idea of powering their, potential power bomb here with ESG certified or sustainability certified energy sources. Are they biting, or is this kind of like give me power from anywhere, I don't really care?
Well, I think there's two different stories in the data center world. One is we need power, we need it yesterday in order to meet the build out and the expectations of investors. Frankly, these companies are leveraged to the hilt. They've become heavy industry. So if you thought Google was this kind of light, sort of low carbon green enterprise, it's now looking a lot more like a large oil sands operations. And if you, as many of us do, get peppered with, job postings on LinkedIn, and a lot of them are looking for the skill sets of people who build stuff. They're looking for regulatory compliance people and energy sourcing people. And so on the one hand, it's we need the electricity yesterday. And then on the other hand, it's that these companies have these very ambitious, net zero or even Microsoft has said we're gonna wind back our carbon emissions right back to our founding in the garage in the early 90s. Well, I mean, so to meet those competing ambitions is going to require kind of massive set of efforts, and that actually takes us into CCUS, but also into nuclear. And whichever of these different pathways, CCUS, nuclear, geothermal is having a real sort of push right now. All of them are just going to take a lot more time. So, in the next sort of decade, these companies are going to be very reliant on natural gas to meet power needs. They're the quickest build out in spite of the backlog on turbines. And in that world, certified low carbon, high ESG natural gas has real traction.
Which comes right back to a huge opportunity for Alberta, because we've got, at Quitno, we joined the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership for the UN. And, that was not such a huge lift, given that we've already done most of the work just meeting the Alberta regulatory requirements for measuring our methane. So, we've got opportunity here to prove to the world that we've got some of the lowest carbon gas on a life cycle basis. We've got an opportunity, if we are effective with carbon pricing, to get to $130 a ton of realized pricing to even reduce methane emissions in our natural gas production and processing areas, even greater. And then we can also sell this ideally, optimally, to power producers and actually get paid for all of the good work that's been done. So this is where I think we are just on the cusp of opening up a whole new area for discussion, and this MOU opens that door.
Yeah. The methane question is a really important one. And you've done a good job of raising it here. The other part that we haven't talked about yet that is a really important component of this MOU that I think it's, capturing a lot of attention as it should, is this question of like the industrial carbon pricing and methane associated with that. Essentially Alberta was in the process of talking about eliminating the industrial carbon price, and now it seems like this deal is basically saying carbon price, it's on and tougher. And what the MOU specifically says is that Canada agrees not to implement the federal oil and gas emissions cap, and in return, both governments commit to globally competitive carbon pricing in Alberta through the tier system, with a minimum effective price of $130 per ton and a methane equivalency agreement targeting a 75% reduction from 2014 levels. How significant is that exactly?
That is a huge step forward. So one school of thought, depending on your perspective, is that the oil and gas emissions cap and the clean electricity regulations, because they actually created little sort of niche boutique carbon credits. You could only cap and trade under the oil and gas emissions cap, so you weren't trading tier credits between industries. The oil and gas industry was capped, and then they made up another type of credit called decarbonization credits at the federal level that were $50 a ton. I think you needed to have PhD just to figure out how you were going to price carbon under all the myriad of schemes and programs and regulations that the federal government and provincial government managed to get going. And then the clean electricity regulations similarly regulated a cap on emissions from natural gas fired power plants. And you could trade among a pool of facilities. If you owned more than one facility, you could trade between facilities to meet that cap. But you couldn't have, for example, power companies buying credits from oil and gas, or oil and gas companies buying credits from power companies. So the whole premise of carbon pricing was that you set a price, and the next marginal abatement opportunity gets financed because somebody can go and sell a credit for that price and get paid. And we managed to really screw that whole price signal up. So I think there's a big opportunity, whether it's methane, whether it's power emissions. We've just got to be going after these reductions. We can't regulate and have a market-based system. And that, quote, realized price, that is the magic word. We need a market of buyers, and we need a market of sellers. We need a much more efficient market. And that conversation, again, has only just begun.
Right, because essentially, so this is talking about $130 per ton, but currently the system is what,
95 in Alberta.
$95 as a ceiling.
But an actual realized price for a tier credit right now, I believe, is around $25.
I think that's high, actually. I have one client who's actively selling credits, and
they're probably getting no interest.
Like less than $20 per ton.
Yes.
So yeah, there's something that's broken there and needs to be fixed.
Broken.
Is it going to lead to reductions if we're talking about intensity-based pricing rather than complete regulation and capping the emissions?
I love this one
On
because, I remember a basic environmental economics class that I took. Where this is going to date me a bit in 1997, in which the professor was explaining, hey, you can use a law to set an emissions limit, or you can price it, and the net effect of the two are the same. Emissions will continue to grow until the price that it
Yeah.
hits is such that you stop emitting, and otherwise you can set a standard and just say everybody can't emit more than this. But the net outcome is the same. So to have both, and then have an interplay of jurisdiction between the two and gaming between the two and carve outs and so on just creates a mess.
So
In my humble opinion.
yeah. So yes. So we're
It's a
trying to fix a
technical
mess
term. It's
here.
a technical term from Jason Switzer, MIT engineer. It's a mess.
Yeah, that's right. So hey, we haven't yet touched on a few other big topics, but I know we'll get to them in future episodes, including Indigenous co-ownership, including carbon capture and storage, and the pathways component of the MOU. But I do think it might be worth sort of just reflecting at this stage, kind of where we're arriving to, which is that the MOU is not a simple pipeline deal. So if anybody kind of sees it as that, it's as I hope you're realizing, it's way more complex than that. There's a lot here. It's a stress test of Canada's climate credibility, industrial ambition, and reconciliation commitments, all at once, all tied together. It could be a blueprint for climate aligned nation building, or hey, it could be a very polished delay tactics with excellent branding and in the short term, getting some political points. Either way, it's setting the frame for almost every conversation that I think we will have through pipelines and turbines this season going forward. Um, you I think you had a reaction to that. Yes, Janet?
I look forward to unpacking the MOU from pathways to CER to AI data centers, Indigenous reconciliation to, we didn't even talk about the tanker ban and
Right.
safety in the Douglas Channel. What is possible now that we can have this conversation about each one of these topics in depth? And the fact that policymakers connected all of these issues that many of us have been talking about for years and put it into one document is just a testament to the fact that we've got to get things moving. I don't see it cynically. I see it as an opportunity.
Awesome.
I think it's an incredibly succinct 6 pages of highly complex things. I mean, we didn't talk about whether there really is the intention to build the pipeline, which plays as a sort of condition. In order, you have to get a pipeline through, but if you don't have BC at the table, and you have Indigenous rights holders who, by dint of the Cowichan decision, legitimately exercise a veto, maybe the whole thing was just a head fake to get the other stuff through. In which case, wow, what a bold climate play, and why the resignations? On the other hand, if you are fundamentally opposed to growing the pipelines side of things, then you're obviously not too pleased that so much of the other stuff that's in there that might be good for climate is hooked onto that. So anyway, I this isn't a hot take. This is a cold take. We're weeks after the fact, and we'll continue unspooling our cold take in the cold light of day over the course of the next few months. I think it's going to be really fun.
So stick with us at Pipelines and Turbines and subscribe to catch new episodes on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube for more deep dives, more uncomfortable questions, and fewer talking points. And thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. We look forward to hearing from you and having many more conversations. Make it good.